Now live.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to this webinar on sustainable beef. What is the role of grass-based beef production systems? This is a webinar hosted by BovINE in collaboration with participants of the EIP AGRI focus group on sustainable beef production. Following a brief introduction to the BovINE network, Lizzie Sagoo from ADAS in the UK will talk to you about the EIP AGRI focus group, and then we will have 4 presentations from participants in the focus group on enhancing farm performance, bringing sustainable beef to the table, certification and labelling, and knowledge exchange. And I think just to highlight that the participants involved are very much bringing diverse knowledge from different perspectives as practitioners and as academic experts, and from many different countries across Europe to address this topic today. Just some practical housekeeping issues. The meeting will be recorded, so your permission is taken as assumed if you have joined the meeting, and the recording will be available following the meeting on the BovINE EU website and via the EIP AGRI portal. We are very keen to encourage interaction, but obviously with the limited time we have available and the number of attendees, we cannot keep the chat function open. However, we do have a questions and answer function available for questions, into which you can also put comments. At the end of each presentation, we will address some of the technical questions briefly, and some of the questions will be addressed directly by the panelists in the Q&A session, and we will keep the more substantive questions for discussion across the thematic areas at the end of the session. Translation is available from English to Estonian, courtesy of our Estonian partner in BovINE. And for those who are interested in that, if you just look at your interpretation option at the end, it comes up as German, unfortunately, rather than Estonian, but that is it's Estonian translation that is available. The next slide, please, Richard. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Bovine Beef Innovation Network Europe. My name is Maeve Henshin. I'm coordinating the project, and it's an EU-funded project that's bringing participants of from across Europe together to address the sustainability of the beef sector. Next slide, please. So I suppose just to clarify, first of all, BovINE, what it is and what it is not. It is not a research project. It is very much about blending knowledge from different sources to the benefit of farmers. So if we have a farmer, for example, who has a specific problem, we want to know what his problem is. So here we have a farmer who is saying, I'm a beef farmer in Ireland, I have a problem. And he wants to know, has anybody ever dealt with this problem? And we have 2 sources of knowledge. The first here is from an academic perspective, and we have a research scientist here in Germany who is aware of the problem and can explain what he has done in terms of providing a research innovation as a solution to the problem identified by the farmer in Ireland. But we also have practitioners across Europe who are involved in the network. And here we have a beef farmer in Spain who is saying that she has had that problem also, and she has identified a good practice that she has put in place to address that problem. Next slide, please. So obviously, if we're trying to address sustainability, that's a very broad area. So what we have done is try to identify 4 thematic areas that we work on. So we start on the bottom right-hand quadrant of the triangle by identifying users' needs. We tap into underutilized knowledge from researchers and practitioners, and then we develop good practices and share them across Europe, across these 4 thematic areas of socioeconomic resilience, health and welfare, production efficiency and meat quality, and environmental resilience. Next slide, please. So in terms of the topics that we have addressed in year 1 of the project, we are now about a year and a half through it. In year 1 of the project, we identified 2 priority topics for each of our thematic areas. And the issues we addressed under socioeconomic resilience in year 1 was long-term business planning approaches and tools and strategies to manage for price volatility and cash flow. Under animal health and welfare, we looked at the health and welfare of newborn calves on suckler farms and the lameness of finisher bulls. On production efficiency and meat quality, we looked at animal monitoring tools in the fattening phase and the use of available data to improve carcass and meat quality. And in relation to environmental sustainability, we addressed needs in relation to reducing carbon footprint and improving water quality and the reduction of water use. So now as we move into year 2, we have identified new priority topics that we want to address in year 2. And here you will see an overview of the topics we are currently looking to provide solutions to. These topics were identified as needs by farmers across Europe, and we are now looking to solutions from research and from practice to address these. And these solutions will be shared with farmers at the national meetings that are coming up and at a transnational meeting. Next slide, please, Richard. So all of the information that we have collected to date is available on the BovINE Knowledge Hub, and you just have to register for that, but it is free to do so, and you will get access to all of the information, which is available in the format of practice abstracts. Next slide, please. And also we have quite a range of audiovisual content, including videos and animations, which are available not only in English, but in the original language, and subtitles in many of them as well. So there's a whole raft of content available for you there. Next slide, please, Richard. So just in summary, the BovINE is an innovation network that involves 18 partners across 19 countries in Europe, addressing the needs of the 255,000 beef farmers across Europe. We have been funded for €2 million across 3 years, and we're about halfway through. Final slide, please, Richard. So just, I suppose, to flag some upcoming events for anybody who's interested, we have a number of national meetings, the dates that you will see there. And at these national meetings, we will be looking to farmers to help us again identify needs that they want addressed next year. And we will be providing solutions to the needs that were identified last year across the 4 thematic areas. So if you're interested in more about the BovINE project, please sign up to our mailing list and have a look at our website where you'll find further information. So now I'm going to hand you over to Lizzie Sagoo, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the EIP AGRI focus group. So thank you very much. Over to you, Lizzie. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Maeve. So my name is Lizzie, and I'm a soil scientist based at ADAS in the UK. The EIP AGRI focus group was set up at the beginning of last year, and it brought together 20 individuals from across Europe with a range of experience and expertise from across the beef sector. The group included researchers like myself, farmers and others working in the beef industry. And the group was asked to address the question, how can grass-based beef production systems based on agroecological principles remain sustainable? Next slide. When the group first met, we spent quite a bit of time discussing how we should define sustainable beef production and what we mean by grass-based. As a group, we agreed to define sustainable beef production as production which is based on agroecological principles of environmental, economic and social sustainability, and for cattle which are predominantly grass-fed and grazed on pastures where possible, given soil and climatic conditions. The figure on this slide here has been adapted from a couple of other sources and was used in our initial discussions about sustainability. And I think it's useful here because it highlights the different components of sustainability. We need a production system which is environmentally, socially and economically sustainable. It also puts social sustainability within the environment and economic sustainability as a subsystem of the total, recognising that both society and the economy are dependent on the environment. And for each of these areas, there are challenges, which you can see shown by red text in the boxes, and also opportunities shown in green text. Next slide. So the group met several times last year. We were asked to identify practices and strategies to increase environmental, social and economic sustainability of grass-based beef production. We decided to focus our discussions on 4 key areas. So improving farm performance, sustainable supply chains, certification and labelling, and knowledge exchange. We've written up the results of our discussions in a final report, which is available via the web link there. If you Google EIP Focus Group Sustainable Beef, you'll find it there. And we've organised this webinar today in collaboration with the BovINE network to present the key findings from the work of the group. Next slide. Before we move on to the main presentations, I'd just like to cover a few acknowledgements. So firstly, thanks to EIP AGRI for setting up and facilitating the focus group. Thanks to the BovINE network for hosting today's webinar, and also to the 20 focus group members and their organisations who gave their time to join the group. So now I'd like to introduce Anna Digon, who's going to talk on the topic of enhancing farm performance. Anna, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this wonderful webinar. I'm going to talk about enhancing farm performance. And so next slide, please. I'd like to first say that I've been working in this topic since 2007 around Spain. And that's where I'm part of and president of the Spanish Association for Regenerative Agriculture. And we have organized hundreds of training events with farmers, because really farmer to farmer training is the way, and exchange is the way for knowledge to be really passed on and to be practiced. And I'm now working for EIT Food with European funding to promote this kind of training and also advice and follow through with the farmers, because this is also necessary, not just training, but then accompanying people, farmer to farmer accompaniment, so that people can put things into practice. So I've had the joy of cooperating with people in Italy, Portugal, UK, Australia, USA, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. We have so much to learn from our Latin American brothers and sisters, and thanks to all of those who've joined today as well from over there. And I'm very proud to work alongside and learn from, and sometimes, like now, speak for literally hundreds of brave pioneering farmers, particularly in Spain, which is an area of systemic interest in this topic, because Spain is still an agricultural country with a rich variety of breeds, of foods, and of practices. And here a lot of damage has been done. A lot of resources have been polluted and depleted, and desertification and loss of fertile topsoil are huge threats to Spanish society, economy, and the environment. So it's a place, it's almost like a point of acupuncture in the world. If we can heal things here where it's so complicated, we hope it can serve as an inspiration to many. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about enhancing farm performance, which is a huge topic, but we're going to focus it on a few key points. Now, the main weakness of grass-based beef systems in the EU are mostly associated with low profitability, productivity, and efficiency. And this leads to a lack of competitiveness when you compare this kind of production, agroecological grass-based beef production, when you compare it to heavily subsidized, more intensive production systems or imported beef products. So it places this kind of production in a weak position. On top of that, there are added problems, like, for example, being actually blamed for climate change, when actually pasture-based, grazed cattle farming can be a huge driver as a solution. As we can see in the image, this is the carbon cycle that is broken in many points, and cattle is part of that carbon cycle, and it can actually serve to heal when properly managed. Next slide, please. So this brings me on to this lovely image, which is now a classic in many places. You can see here on the right-hand side, conventionally managed land, where there's few plant species, no animals, no grazing. And so this is a net emitter of emissions. On the left-hand side, you can see land that is being managed with cattle that is being grazed, in this case, holistically. Basically, what we want is more roots in the soil, more life in the soil, because that is going to be storing and cycling carbon and absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So we can now say, and science is now proving, that when you introduce cattle well managed into the system, the cattle production and management becomes a carbon capture tool. Next slide, please. So the challenges and possibilities of this type of meat production. Basically, grass-based beef systems have a higher environmental and economic sustainability potential when you implement, and this is really important, optimum grazing density and timings, good management practices, and holistic approaches. So we need to be restoring those cycles. On the right, you can see there an image of the mineral cycle. We need to restore it. And the animal, the grazing animal, is actually a driver, a dynamic element that is going to help restore that cycle. So farmers must be allowed and encouraged to take on and improve these holistic, truly regenerative practices and approaches. And I say allowed by legislation and encouraged to recover, because a lot of this knowledge has been lost. So we need to recover that knowledge, and together with cutting edge science and technology, we need to be implementing these kinds of practices. Next slide, please. So here's a lovely graph that is in our report, and I will be touching on 3 of these topics: plant diversity, grazing management, and decision support tools. You can see this in the report. Next slide, please. So grassland resource management and plant diversity, first big point. Now, this is key for grass-based beef farms because they allow the farm to produce beef with low resource input. And at the same time, they provide high input in terms of ecosystem services and public goods, which is really important. Now, the more plant diversity, and this is now being proven scientifically, the more substantial the economic savings and environmental services. And this actually means that also farmers can increase the stocking rate. So you can see here on this picture, 2 sides of the road, 2 different types of management. On the right-hand side is just free grazing, there's no control. On the left-hand side, there is planned grazing, and what is happening here as well is that different grassland species are being introduced into that farm. So basically, that means that this farmer, instead of having to buy more land, is actually being able to put more animals onto the same amount of land, which means increasing the stocking rate. Next slide, please. So some solutions that the group has been discussing and based on our experiences in our different countries as ways to improve pasture quality. Well, basically, starting from the point that grassland management varies a lot due to diverse conditions in each place and requires skills which are adapted to each soil climate condition, to the farm structure and to the specific objectives of each farmer. So here we have a list of some of those solutions. So diverse swards with different species that are adapted to the conditions, weed management, which is a big challenge and can be done with proper grazing, finding optimum diversity of grassland types, improving the nutrient management, and using that the manure as a tool for fertility instead of a problem. In that sense, integration of manure and fertilizers, and performance testing of different grass varieties for different environments. This is a huge area of very interesting research that is taking place and that is definitely interesting for further research. Next slide, please. So about the resources that we have identified as a focus group, here's a few. There are many, but here's a list of some of the ones that are in the report. And there's a couple that I've added that are not actually in the report. One of them is PlantNet, which is just an app on your phone that you can use to identify plants in your field. And another one is the Encyclopedia of Bioindicator Plants by Gerard Ducerf, which is an amazing tool in order to see what the plants that are growing in your soil are telling you about that soil. And then this pasture bank is a small finished tool to connect unused pastures with cattle farmers. This is just an example, but it's something that should be done everywhere to get people who need to feed their animals onto land that is not being grazed. Next slide, please. So second point, and absolutely key, one of the most important topics for grass-based beef systems is the grazing management. And basically, good grazing management and strategies are essential to maintain soil carbon content and increase it, for nutrient cycling and for biodiversity. These in turn improve soil health, make the soil more resilient to extreme weather conditions, which is extremely important at the moment and in the future, and improve pasture growth, improving grazing performance, another key thing. So here in this photo, you can see 2 bits of soil from 2 sides of the road. On the hand that is on your screen on the left is conventional free grazing. There's no control and there's plowing going on. On the right, you can see managed grazing, no plowing, introduction of species that are appropriate to this land. This is after 4 years of this kind of management. Look at that soil health, look at the carbon capture there, and on top, look at all that grass that that farmer now has available for his cattle. Next one, please. So most of the controlled grazing methodologies are based on Voisin's universal laws for rational grazing. And he identified these in the 50s. So here are the 4 laws. And basically, it's about avoiding overgrazing by not letting the animals be on the plot for too long, which is law number 2, and then giving a long rest to the plants for them to recover fully above and below ground before you bring the animals back. That's law number 1, and that avoids overgrazing by coming back too soon. He also identified how you need to match the nutritional needs of the animals with the pasture. And actually, nature is perfect in that sense. Springtime, rain times are when animals need higher nutritional quality. And finally, the importance of moving animals in order to assure a stable nutritional quality. So it's not a sore kind of effect, but it's actually a stable nutritional quality. So that means doing movements of not letting animals be more than 3 days in the same plot, and optimal is movements every day. And people are doing this. There's now the technology to do that with electric fencing, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so some methodologies saying, first of all, that there's no one solution that fits all, and that all the solutions depend very much on all the local conditions. But 3, for example, types of planned grazing that we talked about in the group are dynamic rotational grazing. So for example, you have this Life Herbie project in France, wonderful work they're doing there. Holistic management. Here's a couple of examples in Spain of life projects as well that are finding great results with this kind of management. And Voisin rational grazing, and there I refer you to our Brazilian colleagues in the Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina in Porto Alegre with Professors Pinheiro, father, who unfortunately left us last year at the age of 91 with a huge legacy, and his son and their teams who are continuing that work. They're doing amazing scientific work to prove that actually this kind of grazing and management really improves the pasture, the nutrition of the animal, the quality of the meat and the milk. Amazing work there. So really check them out. Next slide, please. Oh, and I put an image there with the sheep on top. I know we're talking about beef, but it's also applicable to sheep, to goats, even to chickens and other animals. This is an example of Voisin rational grazing planning. Look at all those plots. It's not easy. It has to be said, it's not easy. It requires study, observation, sharing. That's why it's so important to have networks of people. Next slide, please. So there's now more and more proof, both in practice and by science, that is saying that how do we capture carbon in the soil, not turning the soil with deep plowing, keeping the soil covered and promoting animal services, particularly cattle. Next slide, please. Another topic that we were discussing was new decision support tools for precision livestock farming. And there's a lot of tools that are coming up. A lot of them are very useful to be able to make good decisions. And at the same time, for example, virtual fences are something that is being explored. There's issues there to do with animal welfare. And, you know, these are all technologies that need to be explored. And at the same time, the knowledge needs to be in the hands of the farmers, and it shouldn't be technologies that become expensive, complicated, or difficult to run or to fix for farmers. Really, it's in the farmers' hands. It should be at their service, not at their cost, that these technologies are put in place. Next slide, please. And a point about breed selection for pasture-based grazing optimization. Look at these amazing breeds of different animals. Basically, a really key point is to select really well which are the species, the breeds that you're going to be using on the land. There's a lot of space for research in this as well. Very interesting. Next slide, please. So moving forward, taking into consideration regional differences, farm performance could be significantly improved through exchange of knowledge, good practices, innovative approaches, creation of new knowledge exchange networks amongst farmers, developing holistic thinking at all levels, and real support through policies and legislation, not more bureaucracy and complication for farmers, and also informing and educating consumers adequately and connecting them with local producers. Okay, so that's my time up, I think. So next slide, I think that's it. So yes, please check out the focus group report. And there's a lot of information there. And yes, we can do it. We can turn this desert into that prairie and produce this lovely meat in the process. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Anna. And if anybody has any technical questions or queries, please do put them into the questions and answers, and we can deal with some technical questions now, or through the Q&A as the presentations are continuing, or at the end. But I suppose first want to thank Anna for dispelling any myths or illusions that people might have that grass-based beef does not require management or does not involve research and innovation. It very much is the opposite, as you've very clearly identified. So thank you for that, Anna. So I think we have, there's just one question, if you wouldn't mind. What is the role of techniques to reduce methane emissions of cattle in grass-based systems? Would you like to answer that, Anna, please?
Well, I'd have to think about it a bit more, but basically the idea is that when you reconnect the cycles of living soil, plants and animals, the manure becomes something that is absorbed by the soil and nurtures that life. So it stops being a problem, it's a resource. And there's a lot to be said about methane. I'm not an expert about that, but basically we need herbivores in the system. You can be a vegetarian or a vegan if you want. It's great, it's your option, but nature is not a vegetarian. Nature needs all of the levels, and herbivores are a key part of the process. They transform vegetation into protein and into many things, and they cycle, they give that dynamism to the whole cycle. So yes, methane is a byproduct of that, but there's a lot of science that is showing now how those processes are actually part of the whole ecosystem process. So the problem comes when you put all the animals into confined spaces, and so their manure and their methane emissions become a problem. But there's experts who can answer that much better than I am sure.
Okay, big question indeed. So thank you very much for that, Anna. I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is also Anna, but this is Anna Jameson from Sweden, and she's going to talk to us about bringing sustainable beef to the table. So over to you, Anna, when you're ready.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Richard to bring on the slide. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you today about my favorite topic, and my main challenge will be, I think, sticking to the 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. As you saw on Lizzie's first slide, economic sustainability is very much in the core of all of this, and all the production methods are actually aimed at this, bringing the sustainable beef to the table so that we can get paid for it. So next slide, please. Who am I? I work for an NGO in Sweden called Swedish Pasture Beef and Lamb. So we also work with lamb just as much as beef. And we promote beef and lamb production from semi-natural grasslands. That's a definition we're very keen on up here in the north, because it's grasslands, grazings that are never plowed, never fertilized, and never improved in any ways, because they are good enough as they are. I'm an independent consultant, so I work for many other organizations too, but always the core of my subjects are sustainable meat production in various ways. And my organization, Naturbete Kött, we're affiliated to WWF Sweden, who about 25 years ago started looking at this issue very much. So next slide, please. So there are unfortunately quite a few challenges on the way to the consumer. There's a lot of interest in sustainable beef and sustainable foods in general, but I perceive that we have quite a few challenges in actually reaching the consumer. And in our report, we, in the section about bringing the beef to the table, we have brought up many different aspects of this, but I will focus today in view of time on these points. And let's start with the beginning of the end, at least for our animal friends, the slaughter facilities. The nature of sustainable beef farmers are often, as Anna said, that they're scattered, they're fairly small still in many countries, they are remote by definition, they need grasslands, not villages around them. And that means that having a slaughter facility available is very, very important. And unfortunately, centralization has hit the abattoir world as much as everything else. And many slaughter companies are centralized and creating a problem out there. How do you get your animals to the slaughter facility without them having to travel way too far? So we have looked at a couple of alternatives for this, and they are more described in detail in the report, but basically we looked at something called killing in the field, and we looked at mobile slaughterhouses. Killing in the field means what it sounds like. You have a knowledgeable person with a weapon who actually shoots the animal on the farm. They are then bled to death, and after that brought to a proper slaughter facility, an abattoir somewhere, in a designated vehicle. And there are pictures of those in the report for you who are interested also. The advantages of this is that you can have completely stress-free slaughter, even if your local abattoir is fairly far away, the animal is well dead before it has to make that journey. You can pack your products with a lot of animal welfare pluses and on top of your sustainability on your farm. And you also often promote local businesses, because it's often a local meat processing plant that you do bring this animal to. We have studied and we've reported from an interesting Italian project who do this today with pigs, but the technique exists also for bovines and of course ovines. The smaller the animal, the easier, but there is no technical problem per se to do this. Unfortunately, the technique is not legal in many countries. Mine in Sweden is one country that doesn't allow. It's allowed in certain parts of Germany where one can study this as well. And I'm really hoping it will come on a wider scale. We also looked at mobile slaughterhouses. We had a small scale but reasonably successful slaughter company in Sweden that invested in top of the range mobile slaughter trucks. The idea being that they went to the animals rather than the animals having to go to the abattoir. This is a brilliant idea. These trucks come bringing all the resources they need, coolers, water, even slurry tanks come with these slaughter trucks, so you don't have to have anything specific on the farm. This technique has actually existed in Sweden for many, many years up north for the reindeer, so it wasn't new as such, but it just has never been used for domestic or for beef and sheep before. It was initially a success, especially on the market. The product was called ethical meat because of the obvious animal welfare aspects, again, the animals not having to leave the farm and so on. But unfortunately, the mere fact that these slaughter trucks were so highly technical and they were so expensive, the actual available number of animals in Sweden on each farm wasn't enough. So the company went bankrupt after 3 years, and these trucks are now parked up safely next to a dairy farm, a big dairy farm in the south, where they take care of the cows in a very good way on that farm, but the idea failed. But I am sure this will come back in some other more adapted form, because the idea is so good. And as opposed to perhaps killing on the farm, which will always be fairly small scale by its nature, I think that these trucks are going to have a possibility to really be scaled up. Next picture, please. So we're going to talk about short chain and long chain markets a little bit. Short chain markets is when we sell the sustainable beef or any other products direct to the customer. And this has exploded, as I'm sure you all know, during the COVID years, because people didn't feel okay about going shopping, so they wanted to buy their food direct from the farmer instead. And it is a very good idea. Initially, you think you get so much more pay compared to if you sell your animal to an abattoir. But of course, you must realize that you also need to have a whole new set of skills and requirements on your farm, in your time, in your own knowledge of how to do this. So it isn't as easy as comparing the two prices as one might think. And many who have tried farm gate sales actually give up after a number of years because it takes a lot of time. This is a pity, because I think if you look at this, and we have reports in our report, we have studies there from Wales where the numbers have been crunched, and you can look at this and you can really do this successfully, but it will always be a way of maybe producing more of a niche market, I think, because the modern consumer doesn't really want to go every week and shop in 10 different farm shops. But as a smaller thing, I think it's very good. We also in Sweden and Finland and Canada, it's spread to, and UK as well, have something called the Reko, which is basically a social media supported farm gate sale. It's really clever because you use the social media platform to tell the consumer what you have. The consumer then orders what they want. The payment is done digitally also. And then you bring your produce to one designated place, usually once a week, where the consumer come and picks it up. So it's like an upscaling of the farm gate sales, and it has been working very successfully. And I think this will also always be here and might take off in more countries. But we talk a lot about the sustainability, and we want to make a real imprint on the world in changing how we produce this food, and hence we want it to be mainstream. So next slide, please. And there are two mainstream markets the way I see it. One is the public procurement markets, i.e. schools, hospitals, old people's homes. And there's, of course, the big supermarket chains, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But public markets have been shown to be very important, at least in Sweden, in the projects I've been running here. And the reason for that is that the public markets don't want to pay a lot of money for the meat, but they are very stable and they plan a long way ahead. So you get a really wonderful planning platform for your production. You know that you need to slaughter so and so many animals in that week, and then 2 months later, so and so many, and so on and so forth. So we have seen this as a really good extra leg when you promote a sustainable product. It's also, of course, a fantastic PR flag, because who doesn't want to serve the best to children and to the old people, the weaker in society. So, but there are hurdles here, and we describe them in detail in the report. So please look there. I must check the time. Basically, I'd like to sort of say that you have two things to work with here. You need to have a meat sales company on board so that they can fix the answer the local procurement, the public procurement calls. And you also need them for the logistics and for the volume. Sometimes a council will want to buy like 2 tons of minced beef on the same week, and then that could be a bit tricky if you're only 1 or 2 farmers. And then there's the legislation. That there's a wonderful Spanish example how parents and brave civil servants went together and actually changed the criteria so that local and sustainable meat could come on the menu. So please check the report there. Next slide, please. But this is where we want to go. Not because we all have to sort of sell our produce through supermarkets, because God knows that can have complications, but because this is how we want to produce all our meat eventually, and then we need to be in the supermarket. So we need to develop together with large market actors in order to sort of enter their world and let them enter our world, and together find a way of doing this. In Sweden, we have tried and worked and failed and finally succeeded doing this together with both our two large market actors, actually, ICA Ahold and Coop. They're the two main supermarket chains. And we've learned a lot from this. I would say that one of the really difficult things here is to balance the supply and demand. It's difficult for a small group of farmers to be able to answer up to this guy, Thomas, and his need for loads of the same stuff. We also feel that we lose control a bit. How is this promoted? What of our added values does he really want? But on the other hand, in the other scale, there's much less work for us as producers, and we get paid a little bit less than if we sell it ourselves or sell it through social media. So I think we need to come here. And I think that we need to realize that we have to have a lot of trust. We have to have understanding and patience so that the farmers can grow their production not methods, but to grow in volume enough. And as farmers, we need to trust and have patience with these guys who are used to just ringing up and getting exactly what they want the next day from a big provider. So I definitely see this as the future. Next slide, please. So we need to think about what will it take to bring sustainable beef into the future and into being more mainstream. And there's a wonderful table in the report provided to us by Pasture for Life, where they have described the different steps going from niche to mainstream. So I would strongly advise you to look at that. We also need to realize, in order to become mainstream, that farmers don't exist isolated in the countryside. We need all of it, the policies and the political attitudes towards rural societies to work and to be positive towards farming, because otherwise farmers and farming families are going to give up. So grazing and soil health, very important, but we also need social health out there. And the last and maybe most important thing when we talk about going mainstream, everyone wants sustainable meat. Everybody wants to be able to have that in their shops. How do we safeguard our core values? There is a lot of grass washing going on, and I'm so pleased that I'm now handing over to Russ so that he can talk about certification and labels, because I find that so important. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think that was very useful, and there's some good questions in the chat, particularly about on-farm slaughtering. So I think we'll, in the interest of time, we'll move on to allow some of those to be taken care of while Russ is presenting, and we can pick up some of them at the end. But I think also, if you could note that participants could note that we have an offer of assistance from one of our speakers as well, who would be interested in telling you a little bit more about what he's doing. So I've just lost that in the chat, but it was one of our colleagues, I think, from Spain. I'll pull that back out again, but I know we had somebody who was offering to tell people a little bit more about it. And we also had some questions about also Jacopo Jacopo Goracci has offered to tell people a little bit more about on-farm slaughtering for pigs, and there's a Hotmail account there for you. So we'll move on then to introduce Ross Carrington, who's going to talk to you about certification and labelling. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be involved in this webinar, and also just to reflect thanks for the opportunity to be involved in the EIP AGRI group, which has been a fascinating journey for many of us over the last 12 months, and particularly difficult during times of COVID, not actually having opportunity to meet face to face, but we brought together a great network of individuals and tackled many of the challenges and begun to understand a lot of different perspectives across Europe about sustainable beef production. And so I'm going to really focus on certification and labelling and the role that can play. So I'm based in the UK, and I've been involved in developing the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, which has been a farmer-led grassroots organisation developed over the last 10 years to define a brand, a label and certification mark here in the UK for what we believe to be sustainable beef. And more recently have been involved in coordinating and bringing together the Global Grass-Fed Alliance, where in fact we're bringing together organisations that are working in this space, trying to secure clear and honest labelling for sustainable beef and share best practice across our borders. But I'll come a little bit more to that later. And aside from that, I'm also a practicing farmer working on a farm called the Nep Estate, where we're trying to pioneer and develop grazing techniques and put in practice a lot of what Anna from Spain was saying about how we manage the land better for the future. Next slide, please. So as a group, some of us focused on certification labelling, and also work breakout group where we delve deeper into this topic. And one of the things we started to do was really looking very broadly at labelling and all of the things that might entail. Labels are a very practical feature on all food products that cover mandatory features such as allergens or use by dates and other useful information. But those labels are also often an opportunity to convey other useful information to the consumer about how that product has been produced and any credentials that it might carry. Branding, on the other hand, tends to be built around something which has values or personality or a sense of origin, and that tends to be a little bit more bespoke and meaningful in more individual ways. And then looking at certification, that's a kind of whole new realm of assurance and verification about proving what is on the label. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that certification this morning, some of what's involved with that. And in some ways, there's different ways in which that certification is done and presented on a label, but usually it's about certifying conformance to some sort of standards or processes or framework that assures that product has met those certain standards. Now that can be done and verified by third parties, independent auditors. We've certainly seen examples around Europe where that's sort of done by a second party that perhaps is peer reviewed by other farmers working together and verifying one another, or it can be sort of a first party, which tends to be more of self-audit, where farmers are self-acknowledging that they are meeting certain standards, and those different levels carry different amounts of credibility again, which we'll come to. We also looked at the perspectives right across the whole supply chain. We've already been hearing about that from the previous speaker, but they're very relevant to this topic and how certification labelling can be successful to support sustainable beef. Well, we looked at some of the tools for success, some of the challenges in getting there, and some of the examples operating across Europe. Next slide, please. So just firstly, coming to some of the challenges, and I think this is one of the biggest topics that we focused on as a group, and I'm sure we'll be delving into a little bit more in the Q&A, which I'm keen we get to. Coming to a common definition for what we consider to be sustainable beef or grass-based beef production is really challenging, and even more challenging when we look at it on a European scale and the different geographies, the different social and political influences that may affect what's possible and what's not possible within beef production. And so what we came up with as a group is perhaps a fairly broad term based on agroecological principles, and that can of course be interpreted in many different ways. And what we quickly recognise is there are different perspectives across Europe because of those different climatic or political situations. For example, Northern Europe does grow grass really well throughout much of the year, whereas in Southern Europe that can be a little bit more challenging, so the techniques for management have to be adapted and be somewhat different. And so having a set of standards which actually clarify that definition has been really important as a challenge to overcome. The economics are also a really key issue, and it's really hard when farmers and supply chains are trying to do something better. It tends to invite extra costs, and those extra costs come from simply trying to do something different to the norm around managing integrity through a supply chain. So if there's a piece of meat or an animal that comes in from the farmer on the left-hand side of this chart carrying a particular certification or label, how that integrity of that product, of that animal, of the subsequent meat, and then the packaging is kept right through to the final consumer, and that requires more work within the supply chain, more checks to be done, and therefore more cost. And then very often each of the actors within the supply chains are having to pay for those audits, pay for the paperwork and certifications that take place. And so there is a barrier for adoption through this, through the whole supply chains. But ultimately, it's around whether those extra costs are returning better value, better premiums for the product at the end of the day, or even whether it's offering better routes to market or routes to market for the future. And we all know that the marketplace is changing quite rapidly, especially in the last 12 months with COVID and how that's been impacting what people are tending to want to buy. And so some of these costs are opportunity costs that have to be born to stay on the forefront of where the markets are shifting to, and in some ways staying in business. And then I want to introduce this term grass washing, which is perhaps a bit of a play on words from greenwashing. But across Europe, we saw many examples where claims were being made about on labels or in conjunction with marketing and selling of products that was suggesting that the product was sustainable, and yet by our definitions as a group, we weren't sure whether that was actually the case and whether there was an element of greenwashing going on and marketing jumping on the bandwagon of an interest in sustainable beef without necessarily backing that up with authentic audits and checks. And the downside to this is that it loses consumer trust, and it leads to misleading messaging and ultimately confusion with consumers. And that's perhaps a really slippery road for us to be on. And so it's important for us all to be able to call that out and make sure that any claims that are being made are in fact genuine. Next slide, please. So to try and summarize really what success looks like for the different models we looked at across Europe, it's perhaps best summed up with this diagram, which hopefully illustrates the need for finding that sweet spot and fine balance between the marketplace and what consumers are looking for, what's practically working for farmers in their different farming climates and soil types and landscapes, and what is actually provable and evidenced by science and backed up by science. And it's really tricky to find that sweet spot. But it is important to bring in those multiple perspectives which inform what is sustainable beef and what people's expectations of it are, and what actually practically works. And within that sweet spot, then that gives the opportunity to really strongly advocate and acknowledge and recognise something which is genuinely better and prove to be better if it's backed up with systems of audits. It's also an opportunity here to recognise that in sustainability, because it's very hard to define, actually what we're all trying to do is striving for better. And so many of the labels and certification schemes we looked at are trying to recognise that continual improvement. And that is important because science is developing all the time. Farmers are able to learn new ways and push their own abilities further, their own land further in terms of what is sustainable. And of course, the marketplace is changing all the time. So there's an important recognition in here in this sweet spot of continual improvement and continually striving for better based on what we're learning all of the time. Next slide, please. So just quickly, some examples that we encountered across Europe, and the four I've shown here, the Pasture for Life certification mark in the UK, which I've been involved with, the Grass-Fed Association in Italy, which now has its own brand up and running, in Estonia, state certified grass-fed beef, and in Sweden, pasture beef and lamb Sweden, which Anna mentioned earlier. And perhaps the reason I've flagged some of these in particular is that they do have rigorous standards sitting behind them. They're all third-party audits now, which kind of gives them a maximum credibility. And those standards have been developed in conjunction with the farmers, with consumers and scientists, and there's a consideration for the whole supply chain. And there are also now national schemes in each of their cases, which is sort of maximising the exposure to consumers in those individual countries, and that perhaps then also helps to clarify a common definition in each of those countries. But there are other examples as well, like from really local, small-scale local brands that are recognising products from individual valleys or counties within countries, and they range from being cooperatively owned or farmer-owned, sometimes involving members of the supply chain, through to privately owned organisations, or even government-led and government-owned schemes. And so it's probably quite important with the different political situations and cultural situations in different European countries that there is a variety of different approaches is healthy. But one thing is there's some really good collaboration going on with each of these examples. It's farmers working together. It's farmers working together with the supply chain to help navigate that sometimes complicated and difficult journey, linking to the consumer and understanding the science. And so there is a real variety around Europe, and some of these we felt some of the best standout examples. Next slide, please. But there are some things that could really help reinforce the power of these schemes and the power of labelling to help bring more sustainable beef to the market and to consumers. And one thing definitely is around better regulation of labelling, and to move away from misleading labelling claims and move away from things like grass washing that is leading to consumer confusion. We have to be able to strengthen those links with our consumers and our customers to support the right type of farming that we're advocating. And so we do feel that government has a role to play there in ensuring that to happen. As I mentioned, it is difficult across the whole supply chain to manage the integrity of sustainable beef, however we might be defining it. And so support for farmers and supply chains wanting to do this should be welcomed, and to engender that spirit of continual improvement to help us all get better as we learn more about new ways of doing things. And I think really as a bonus outcome of this EIP working group has been, it's shown just what the benefits are of our exchange between one another. And so we feel more exchange between organisations working in the labelling and certification space would be very beneficial to helping us all get better, and perhaps helping us all to achieve that common European definition for sustainable beef, and helping to work together to drive more of it forward for the future. So that's all I have to say in a nutshell. I look forward to some further discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. And I think the importance of trust, developing and maintaining it, I think it very clearly came through. That we have a few minutes for questions before we move on to the next question. And there's one very specific question there from Chris Poole, and I see Anna's starting to answer it, but if you might maybe respond as well, Russ. It's for small farms where the price of third-party certification is too large a hurdle. Do you think participatory guarantee schemes have an option?
Yes, I definitely do think participatory guarantee schemes do have that option. And in fact, in the UK, that's kind of what we were doing initially before we went for the third-party auditing. And so I think there's a whole sort of spectrum of possibilities in this labelling space for what helps those farmers to connect with consumers that value the way that those products have been made. And as long as that value or that expenditure to achieve that verification is proportionate to the value that is returned through a better price or a more secure route to market, then I think that's for individual businesses to make that call. But certainly there are many ways to go about this, and in fact I think more the merrier to help along that journey.
Great, thank you very much, Russ. And a colleague, I think Gillian B, has drawn attention to evidence on the better nutritional quality of meat from pasture systems, and has put a paper into the questions and answers as well that I just like to draw people's attention to. So we're a little bit ahead of time, but I think it's probably opportune to move on, because there are a number of questions that are coming up on the chat that probably warrant a bit more in-depth discussion later on, particularly, for example, relating to the definition of grass-based, pasture-based beef and issues relating to that, which we hope to take up at the end. So I will now hand you over to Irina Herson from the University of Helsinki, who's going to talk to us about knowledge exchange.
So hello on my behalf. So I work as an educator and researcher in the University of Helsinki. Next slide, please. But my experience as an educator is quite diverse. I don't only teach the university graduates, and they're increasingly going into farming sector and the ministries and advisory services. So these are people who represent the actors across the whole food chain. But I also do quite a bit of research in Finland and across Europe, and some of it relates to the biodiversity in farming systems, and some of those systems are pastoral. We call them high nature value farmland systems. So this topic is particularly relevant for those. And I also work on systemic issues of sustainability. So it's not just biodiversity, not just production, but the overall impacts of what we grow and how we consume. I also work, or have been working quite a bit with policy on the European Union level, but also nationally in Finland, on formulating and implementing those agri-environmental payments, which were mentioned as very important also for beef producers. And indeed, for example, in Finland, up to half of all the income of farmers, and much more even for beef producers, come from such payments. So this is not negligible. And also my family is involved into managing a large farm by Finnish standards, and all our beef is grazing those semi-natural grasslands that are can be used as an example of those multi-functional high-value systems that also produce quality product. And we sell everything directly to our customers. So I have this diverse experience professionally with this beef production issue. And now next, please. So in this particular focus group, I led a small group working with knowledge exchange systems. And so in our work, we generated experiences of all members with successful stories, good practices, what can work in knowledge exchanges, what are limitations. We collected quite a number of examples that is described in much detail in our report, so you can go and read through them yourselves. So there are very big projects there, large national delivery, knowledge delivery systems, but also specific small aimed at such beef producers as in this focus group we aim at. We also worked with networks such as BovINE project here, networking project. There are several examples of those of relevance. We also looked at how well the current advisory systems, or what is called now AGRI systems in the European Union, actually deliver for sustainable beef production. And to our experience, mostly they're failing on this in many countries because these particular systems are not well addressed by the mainstream AGRIs. So there is a need for such organizations as RAS was presenting, or Anna. So they're really working with certification targeted to producers of such beef. And there is obviously an issue there. Next, please. Now we identify 8 main points of success factors of what works well when we speak about knowledge exchange, or efficient knowledge exchange, specifically with such systems as beef production. Well, the first probably should be mentioned is the inner ring of advisors, and we talked quite a bit that farmers, of course, are very different, as all people are, but all farmers as a professional group have so-called some key actors that they hold trustworthy and influential, and this is what was mentioned before. And frequently these are other farmers that have very similar, or maybe even entirely the same system, and therefore they share additional values associated with such production. And as you heard, such values are extremely important. So wider sustainability values or animal welfare values, anything that comes on top of just economic profit. So then examples of farmers that manage such systems successfully. So for example, successful pasture management, as Anna referred to. These are people that can be exceptionally influential, especially in this sustainable beef production. We really thought that very often mainstream AGRI's advisory system fail on it. Then the second was the facilitation process as a very important issue, because often advisory comes to producers as a knowledge transfer. So there is an expert and then a learner, which is a producer. And that, what we know from many of our experiences and also from research, is not the best way of learning. So increasingly people who are engaged in knowledge exchange should possess very good facilitation skills, and they should be trained for such skills, which often, again, our educational institutions often fail on it. So facilitation can be even more important than specific formal knowledge, because involving producers into a process successfully can really generate an impact. Very often in projects, advisors come from outside, or researchers indeed come from outside, and they try to teach something that they think could be a good idea, and that doesn't work. And also experience of some of us, including the Pasture for Life in the UK, which Ras introduced to us, that young farmers can be very good facilitators, because they are prepared to think differently. And here we really try to think differently, so improving something that is being shown to be not very sustainable, beef production as such. And then seeing is believing. Indeed, part of the sort of learning is not about gaining amount of knowledge, but actually engaging in it. And here everybody basically who was involved in this focus group come up with examples of how to organize some farmer or case stories, and personal learning journeys can be very powerful learning experience. So all kind of share fairs or cross visits in which farmers are involved alongside with other actors are very powerful tools and should be promoted whenever it's possible. And we also realize that now with the current pandemic situation, some good came out of it, because such online webinars and videos became more and more in use, and we have experience with it. And that can actually help also engage farmers who otherwise might not have access to specific advisory services in their region, or specific knowledge indeed that is fitting for their farm case. appropriate knowledge at the right time. We talked quite a lot about this because farmers vary in the way they experience this transition towards a more sustainable production system. Some of them are novices and some of them are quite advanced practitioners. So the advisory event may miss both sides if it's kind of targeted on the majority rather than specific needs. And what also came up as an interesting issue in our discussion was from the experience of this project in which RAS is involved, that in Pasture for Life project, is that often when people, in this particular case producers, are faced with an issue, for example, in this case, public disapproval of beef production, they may feel shocked by it because that's the way of living they have been having all the time, and suddenly they're told that it's not good, it's not humane, it's not sustainable. And that can be quite a nasty surprise, and not all people are prepared to deal with it. Some of the people go into denial. And so reaching such people and trying to deliberate on this issue and engage them into this change that it's needed can require quite an effort, and we need those facilitation skills and also the way to put information in a way that doesn't lose those people, but give them hope that this change is possible and that can be beneficial. So we talked quite a lot about this, and so people at different stages of their transitional journey towards the different production of beef are needed to be captured and examples being delivered exactly to serve their needs. Also, we did recognize that in many cases, rather than having sort of an ideal, a perfect model of production, we need to stress that even minor improvements are important, so that people don't lose the hope to improve, even if that the perfect model may not be possible in their context at any given time. Overcoming barriers, that's something again came up frequently, because farming in a farming community, producers experience pressures from the family and from other peers, and change often comes as taking people from their comfort zone, and that's uncomfortable. So the need for support is important, and through again coaching with advisors, maybe not a single advice event, but really coaching, so that there is more systematic support given to producers that are trying new things, and by this they also enter into some financial risks or maybe even reputational risks, something that we've seen people on this panel are doing nationally and regionally. A systemic approach, finally, is that we realized that very often farmers face contradictory advice if it comes from different perspectives. For example, if we use individual parameters of sustainability, carbon could be a very good example. If it's measured per unit of product, then very often intensive production systems come as better off. So the multiple values are being lost with such assessment systems. And so advice can lead to a change into one direction, when advice from another perspective can contradict it. And that is being experienced by many farmers as a challenge. So such a systemic and holistic advice is often a critical barrier in knowledge exchange systems. It's not very often available because advisors also may have a rather narrow perspective on what they regard as sustainability. Yet also this process needs to include not just producers and say advisors, but also the whole chain, retail system, made perhaps through certification, and also consumers. So consumers are more and more detached now from production. So drawing them into understanding the farming realities are important if we want to have a systemic approach. Of course, decision makers should be on board as well. Next, please. We talked about, or we mapped challenges and opportunities that such grass-fed, pasture-based beef production may have in future. And one of those was a high dependence on subsidies in the context of European Union. As I mentioned, quite a lot of income for farmers still comes from such public payments. And these payments can and already have quite uncertain future, especially beef now being very much under criticism. So that presents a real challenge with which we have to work. So how the system can be also profitable, even if the changes in public support may have, or then how to change the public support system so that it doesn't lose on sustainability issues, even if it changes. Then, of course, risks from climate change, from water issues, from biodiversity crisis issues are important, and they're increasingly taking also in public policy. And that may also increase regulatory risks, because whenever we attach some values to such very difficult measured issues as public benefits, the amount of regulation and control may also become more cumbersome and difficult. It's very easy to pay just per kilo of product or hectare of land. How to reward farmers for such additional benefits is still a big issue. On the good side, from many countries with which we worked, we realized that especially the recent pandemic caused actually an increasing demand for sustainable and high welfare beef, also locally produced. The ecosystem that Anna from Sweden mentioned previously has been quite a game changer. For example, in Finland, our farm basically ran out of all beef. We had to turn down customers because of that demand. We also know that we described many existing and very diverse examples of peer-to-peer knowledge exchange networks and systems. So they do exist, and tapping into them is important. What is also good that now that online tools became more mainstream, they allow people who are in some ways sort of marginalized access such tools and such information. Also, translator systems improve all the time, so there is more possibility for cross-border and cross-national knowledge exchange. If certain information and experience is lacking in, say, in Finland, we can more easily now tap in it from Spain and vice versa. And what we also found as very encouraging is that increasingly national and EU level research projects demand work with other actors outside of research academic communities. And that's something as a researcher I experience all the time. I can't basically anymore submit a proposal unless I prove that I work with multiple actors, including producers and advisors and decision makers. So this kind of pressure on researchers is a positive issue, which is challenging for us researchers, but I think it's a very beneficial in the long term. And the same way, I guess, we need also farmers to be aware of such possibilities, so they come more and more into research projects and give input and direction of where to take it. Next, please. So based on all this, we outlined some recommendations, and there's much longer list that I have on this very short slide. So for farmers, as I mentioned, to be active and engage into such knowledge exchange networks, also research projects, the possibilities are there. So new media for information, training, innovations, and that's what, if you're a farmer now attending this webinar, is what you're doing indeed, but also giving sort of feedback on what should be included in such webinars, what the needs are. And also connecting with local champions. That was again stressed by many farmers in our focus group. For researchers, well, I think I described this by now. So we do want to have a knowledge exchange or the knowledge transfer. So it's not like us experts giving advice what to do, is much more listening also and learning from others. And finally, for knowledge exchange providers, so to target the whole system rather one element of it. So it's not only about feeding regime of cows, but the whole sustainability dimension of the production. And then to have much more support, to give much more support to pioneering farmers and advisors and educators. So people who are not working within the mainstream, but are trying new things and by this taking risks. So these are the people who need much more support that are currently given. And with this, I think I'm finished. So next, yes.
Thank you very much, Irina. I think that brought the whole series of presentations very well together. I think it just highlights very much the need for us all to work together and to exchange knowledge with each other. We have just about 7 minutes left. I think we had a cluster of questions that related to on-farm slaughter and mobile slaughtering. So I might just ask Anna Jameson to maybe start some of the responses on those questions, and then we'll maybe take the question relating to the definition of grass-fed beef as well before we come to the end. So Anna, there were some questions about on-farm slaughtering, asking about its legality, and I suppose its consistency with high levels of food safety, and maybe consumer perspectives with regard to it as well. And then there was a fourth question about comparing the energy requirement of centralized slaughtering and those aspects with more decentralized. So maybe you could take the legality and food safety maybe first.
Yeah, I'll do that. The legality is complex. It's not allowed in most countries in the EU, I think, at the moment. There are some special areas in Germany where you're allowed to do it, but only on animals that live outside all year round, I think. I know Simona is in the chat, so she can probably add more about it. There's a lot of research being done here. So there's obviously, I shouldn't say obviously because it's not, but there is a lot of work done to make sure of the hygiene quality of, we don't want to start lowering the food safety standards here. That's not the point at all. So this designated vehicle I mentioned is actually a pretty fantastic little thing that can be drawn behind an ordinary car for smaller animals, and that takes care of the carcass in a very hygienic way. So this is an area to be looked at. There was just a big questionnaire out from the Commission about it earlier this year. So I think we should definitely keep on pressing for this, because I think it's a wonderful technique that suits some farms. And yes, I mean the animal still needs to be checked by vet before it's killed, and the carcass needs to be checked by vet, but that can be done at the abattoir. So there are, it's only the actual killing that's moved out. And then I would love to, I promised in the chat to try and find more technical reports on the prestanda of the mobile slaughter tracks, because they were heavily research by SLU, the Swedish Agriculture University, as you can imagine, and the Food and Safety Department also. So I think there are reports, and I can try and compile them for people who are interested. So I put my email address in the chat. If somebody wants to just shoot me an email, then I can answer all of you with what I can find.
And sorry, has any work been done, Anna, to the best of your knowledge, that models the overall sustainability of the centralized versus decentralized slaughtering? Has something been done on that? Do you know?
Probably not, because we only had that one company with the slaughter trucks. So, and the centralization of the big slaughter companies have happened before the sustainability issue came up. I know that in Sweden, we have a group working on sustainability within the whole industry chain, and they are looking at the abattoirs, but not specifically comparing small ones out in the countryside and big ones, because as you can imagine, the big ones will have more technology and more resources to work on their cooling systems and all this sort of stuff that creates sustainability. So I think this is probably a complex question that will take further research.
Okay, and does anybody else, maybe Anna, does anybody else from the panel want to add to that discussion?
Yes, I'd like to say that there's a couple of experiences here in Spain now with these mobile abattoirs that are starting up. So let's see how that goes, but definitely it's a very real option for many people, and we hope that, you know, from your experience, Anna, in Sweden, that things can be learned, you know, that from mistakes we can learn and we can do things better. And there was a number of questions in the chat that I'd just like to make a comment to answer to a few of them. That has to do with communicating with consumers, the importance of consumers. You know, consumers lead the market, and we know this. And so it's not easy to simplify messages in order for people to really get the depth of what is behind a definition. But definitely, if the concept is, well, cows emit carbon, therefore if we want to reduce carbon, let's have less cows, which somebody was saying is the case in Ireland. Basically, it's not the cow, it's the how. And that is key in this whole process, this whole dialogue. So we need to communicate that in simple terms that people can understand, but that also allow people to make choices that are informed. And yeah, it's not the cow, it's the how. I'll pass on to someone else.
Thank you, Anna. And I think just to add to that, there is some more information put in by Simona in the chat or in the questions and answers about slaughtering on farm and a website if people want to have a look at it. It's obviously available in German. And Irene, I know you have your hand up, so if you could add to that discussion as well, please.
Thank you, Matt. Anna, I agree with you only partly because, again, as a researcher in sustainability, you also look at the global picture. There is currently 1 billion of cattle heads in the world, and that's definitely not sustainable in any way, including, for example, biodiversity. 60% of all biomass of mammals in the world now is domesticated animals, and only 7 wild animals. So when you're faced with such big issues, then also how many and cow become an issue, and to address them on the balance is very important. It's easy to lose this global picture if you work with locally or regionally sustainable systems.
Thank you, Irina. I think it's all a question of scale and having that systemic perspective across scales and temporally and everything as well. So there's a lot of issues for us to think about, which we're obviously not going to be able to get into. We actually just have we have less than a minute left. But so I would just want to thank everybody for their contribution. I want to thank Lizzie, Anna, Russ and Irina for your presentations, and also the wider group who contributed to the EIP AGRI Focus Group report, some of the people who are participants today as well. So I think we will officially close the webinar now, but we will leave it open for a few more minutes because it would be useful to have a short discussion on the definition of grass and pasture and finished and raised and all of that. So just to remind people that the recording will be available on the BovINE website subsequently. So you're welcome to finish now, but we'll take another 5 minutes just to allow our panelists to give their perspectives and on the different definitions. And we have a poll as well, if you might be interested in contributing to it. There are 2 questions basically. One is asking, what does sustainable beef mean to you? And it's whether it's 100% grazed and grass-fed, predominantly grass-fed and grazed where possible, fed predominantly or entirely with grass. On the other side, biomass, part of a production system based on agroecological principles, or you don't know. And then the second question is, what can be done to bring more sustainable beef to the market? A number of options there regarding to knowledge exchange, label certification development, agreeing on a common definition, more policies aimed at sustainable production or others. So we invite you all to make your answers now. Just for your information, the hosts and panelists cannot vote. So it's the response to this reflects all of your responses. So we'll just give you a minute to give your answers, and we'll share that with you, and then we'll maintain a few minutes of discussion on the definition. And as I say, the recording will be available for you afterwards anyway. So we'll just let that poll run for a minute. And while that poll is running, who of our panelists wants to be the first to, so the first, you will all just get an opportunity. So do you want to be first or last or in the middle? So Russ, you're going to go first. Okay, good one.
Yeah, I will. I'll just perhaps add a few points on the discussion of definition. And of course, there's lots of different perspectives on what the definition of sustainable is. But as I mentioned, the whole move, or the need for us all as society and as a planet to strive for better is an important one. And I think what we've seen with many of the successful labels and certification schemes across Europe is that they're encouraging change. So in some ways, they're setting the bar quite high, and that's encouraging farmers to seek solutions and work harder for building more resilient soils and building better animal welfare systems and ultimately producing more nutrient dense or better quality meat. And so it's important, I think, that we set the bar high enough to keep it moving, keep our farmers and our supply chains improving, and good high definitions do help achieve that. We've seen that already in our research.
Thanks, Ross. So who's next? Anna, you're off mute. Do you want to go next, Anna Jameson?
Oh, sorry, there's so much going on. I was answering a question in the Q&A. Well, so I feel that, I think I put that in the Q&A as well, that I believe we can't come with a common definition because our production systems are so different. We need to, for instance, in Sweden, focus very, very hard on these semi-natural grasslands. Doesn't mean that it's not important to graze animals on any type of grassland, improved ones also, but for our biodiversity, these are key. And we must, so hence, we let our side down and think it's okay to feed a little bit of grain at the end of the animals' lives because they've been out 2 whole summers preserving biodiversity. Whether, as you know, Russ and I have this argument about this because 100% grass is better, he says, but I say no under our conditions, probably yes under your conditions. So you see what I mean, that we are all driven by the same passion, but it has to be channeled in slightly different ways.
Thank you, Anna. And Lizzie, I believe you're unmuted. So if I give Lizzie and then Irina and then Anna, and then we'll close. Thank you.
I was just thinking back to the discussions we had about the difference between sort of grass-fed and pasture-fed. I think we all agreed that grazed grass was most efficient feed and was a sustainable system, and that we like to see the animals out at pasture where they could be, but also acknowledging that in some areas that it's not possibly environmentally sustainable to have cattle out all the way through the year when the ground is too wet. But equally, we did have a discussion again about these sort of zero graze systems where you might have a grass-fed system, but the cows aren't out. And I think that was something we all felt a little bit uncomfortable with. So I think, yeah, agreeing with Anna's comment that it does vary very much depending on where you are and the climate conditions as well.
Thank you, Lizzie. Sorry, Irina.
what I would like to bring out also is the importance of integration of arable production and animals. This is often when working with beef production, tend to forget. We do need arable cropping and arable production. So how to make animals work for these systems better, for example, as sources of manure, as sort of bringing grassland into crop rotations, and etc., etc. So these are what those broad agroecological principles would mean, circularity, etc. So these mixed systems are exceedingly important and will be more important in future, I guess. So using animals for what they're good is, as in traditional system, they used to be.
Thank you, Irene. And I think that brings us very nicely back to Anna, who started some of our initial presentations, very much emphasizing the management and the thinking and the science and everything that needs to be behind grass-based production systems, or indeed any sustainable production system. So I give the final word to you, Anna.
Thank you, Maeve. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Irina, for bringing that up. I mean, thank you. That was a missing piece of the puzzle, because really it is about integrating productions. And so I'd like to bring as a final comment that we hold yearly meetings here in Spain of cattle farmers. That in Spain we have a range of climates from rather humid to very, very arid, almost desertic. And also our colleagues overseas contribute to these meetings, and what they are saying, the farmers are saying, which for me is so important, science is really important, and what the farmers are saying complements that, is that they can produce pasture-based healthy meat that is economically and environmentally and socially sustainable and regenerative. In fact, for them, once they start on that road, it is the only way for them to be efficient, for them to be profitable, to be resilient in their farms, and to be happy, which is also a great thing to bear in mind. The family needs to be happy. Young people need to want to continue with the work on the farm. It needs to be something that's attractive. There's lots of work and employment that can be generated around farming, not just the actual farming, but around it, as we can see, just the communication, distribution, sales. There's so much work and there's so much unemployment right now. Let's bring the work back to the land and bring the people back on the land. So thank you, everyone, really, for this opportunity, and our hosts, BovINE, Maeve, and the whole team. It's been a joy to work together for this last year and a half.
Thank you, Anna. So I think we can hopefully ultimately actually give the final answer to our final word to our participants by sharing the results of the poll with you all there. So you can see differences of opinion there with agroecological system principles seen as very important, and obviously predominantly grass-fed. Maybe 100% people recognise maybe that's not realistic in all contexts. And then the what can be done, more policies, looking to other people to help, but also I suppose something that's people can do themselves in terms of labelling and certification and agreeing on a common definition, and obviously knowledge exchange as well. So hopefully the participants in the focus group and the participants in BovINE will continue to share knowledge over the next while. So with that, I'll draw it to a close. Thank you again to our participants. Thank you to Richard for keeping everything going in the background, and thank you to all of our everybody who attended, and look forward to following up with some of you. Thank you.